Donkey Kong Country is wildly held as a genre-defining classic. It's one of the most popular platform games of its era, so much so that the game spawned 2 Super Nintendo sequels, 2 revivals in the last decade, and was ported to 2 separate Nintendo handhelds, one of which I've talked about on the show before. Here's a clip. Right, yes, not a fan of that one. Actually, something I forgot to mention when I first made this episode back in 2013, Christ, is the main reason Minecart Carnage is so much harder on the Game Boy Color. In the Super Nintendo original, when you hit an obstacle but you still have a monkey in the card, it automatically does a little hop. The Game Boy Color version doesn't do this, which is annoying because as most of the obstacles are placed at the end of a track, you need that jump to be able to continue the level. See? It's not that I'm bad at games posting it, it was developer oversight. Donkey Kong Country has also been re-released as a virtual console title for the Wii, the Wii U, and the Nintendo 3DS, and was the only Donkey Kong game included on the SNES Classic Mini in 2017, though that can be fixed with a little modification. But allegedly, Donkey Kong Country might not even have existed were it not for an entirely unrelated decision made by a company with zero connection to either Nintendo or Rare. A 2010 article from the now-defunct NowGamer.com alleges, without citing any sources, that Nintendo specifically approached Rare asking them to make a game with, quote, better graphics than Aladdin, the 1993 Virgin Games title for the Sega Genesis, based on the 1992 Disney movie, itself based on the story Aladdin and the Magic Lamp from 1001 Nights, an anthology of stories written, or at least collected, throughout the Islamic Golden Age, though the story of Aladdin was actually added to the anthology in an 18th century translation by the French author Antoine Galland. Seriously, look it up. Now again, NowGamer didn't cite any sources for its claim that Donkey Kong Country owes its existence to Nintendo wanting to outdo Aladdin on the Genesis, and a quick and possibly poorly worded Google search reveals both bugger and all out there to suggest any link between the two games. But Aladdin did influence platform games in the mid-90s, and rightly so. Not only did it feature fresh animation from the team at Disney Studios themselves, something that would be repeated in later games, including The Lion King, which was released for a ton of systems, and Hercules, which only made it as far as the PC and the PS1, but the development for Aladdin was led by British programmer David Perry, seen here trying to do a shadow puppet while Jigglypuff lurks just off camera, waiting for a chance to strike. Though let's not confuse David Perry with British games expert, and I'm using sarcastic quotation marks there, Dave Perry, seen here patiently waiting to speak to your supervisor, no, it's fine, he'll wait, who once famously had a bit of a passive-aggressive temper tantrum on British telly after losing a competitive Mario 64 race.
I think having a final game where one player owns the game in the machine and one player isn't in the interests of fair play.
So we're not seeing side regrets at all here, Davis, what you're trying to say?
No, we're not. We're seeing somebody just saying he's been set up.
You can't say that on British television! The nerve. David Perry is a name you should recognise if you were playing games during the 90s because he and his team made a string of highly desirable and beloved platform games, many of which are still fondly remembered to this day. So strap in using your FilmJoy brand edge of seat chair buckle as we jump in to this topic, the one we've already started talking about. I used to be better at these transitions. Thad, do title, please. Make do title. Make do title. Title do. Firstly, before we begin, it's time to clear up a misconception. Aladdin was not a Genesis exclusive. Yes, people like to refer to it as the Sega Genesis Aladdin because, well, Sega published the Genesis version, but there were alternative console games based on the movie, including a parkour-heavy platformer for the Super Nintendo developed by Capcom, and a Master System game released only in Europe and Brazil that has trouble deciding whether it wants to be an endless runner or a Prince of Persia-style puzzle platformer. Though surprisingly, it's not terrible, and it hews a lot closer to the story from the film than Aladdin games by other developers. So that's a nice little shock. The Genesis Aladdin game first dropped at the tail end of 1993, and it was a heavy hitter for the system, selling 4 million copies and becoming the 3rd best-selling Genesis title during the entire life of the console. But the game actually got released for a few other systems over the next couple of years, including the NES, the Game Boy, the Amiga, and PC MS-DOS, a port which actually benefits from then recent developments in sound hardware, allowing the developers to use the music from the near-identical Amiga version, as opposed to the tinny, MIDI, samey-wamey sound of the Genesis original. This means that although these versions have a slightly cramped screen due to the chunky top screen HUD, they easily have the best sound of all of the ports, no matter what Doom11 on GOG.com says.
Apparently, this episode is all about calling out negative comments on the internet, so yeah, watch yourselves out there.
Capcom's lock on the Disney license for the Super Nintendo meant that Virgin's Aladdin never made the leap to the Super Nintendo, but Nintendo fans did get to play the Virgin game's Aladdin in the form of an NES port developed by NMS and put out in 1994, though the less said about this the better. I'm going to keep talking about it anyway. About a third of the levels were cut, the sprites are absolutely tiny, and the entire game uses the same miserable colour palette, and that's largely because this port was based on the Super Game Boy version of the game put out around the same time. It's honestly not a great port. Too much focus was put on squeezing in as many frames of animation as possible, and consequently it feels a bit slow and unpleasant to play. Much later, Disney Interactive and Ubisoft put out a fresh port for the Game Boy Color, with the porting duties handled by Crawfish Interactive, whose other handheld hits include Nicktoons Racing, Mary-Kate and Ashley Get a Clue, and a game based on the movie The Sum of All Fears for some reason. Rather than simply duffing out a colorized version of the previous Game Boy release, as had happened with other titles that got a Game Boy Color reissue, Crawfish opted instead to build a brand new port of the game from the ground up, which, given the state of the old Game Boy version, probably sounds pretty appealing right up until you actually play it and discover it's only marginally better than its Game Boy predecessor. I literally finished the Sultan's Dungeon level in this game by clipping through several walls. Yikes. There was also a Game Boy Advance port of the Capcom Super Nintendo version, which is a pretty faithful port, but isn't particularly relevant to the larger subject at hand, so I'm just gonna stop talking about it. Aladdin was a commercial and critical success, which was surprising considering it was a licensed game, and licensed games were, and arguably still are, mostly terrible. In a world filled with plenty of rushed-out-the-door cash grabs and cynical tie-ins, Aladdin caught people by surprise, not just because it was good, but because it was a licensed game where the developer had put in the care and craft to make it look and feel amazing, which even today isn't always the case. Development of the game started in January of 1993 and was wrapped up in August the same year for an October release. A shockingly quick turnaround for a game, particularly by today's standards, especially considering they had 10 Disney animators working on the game, but they had a number of tools at their disposal to speed along development, one of which was, well, a game engine that Perry's team had already developed and had been used for a handful of other games. See, back in the day, Dave Perry, seen here getting ready for a big old slumber party, actually worked on a bunch of video game ports, which makes him my new best friend. He was a programmer on the ZX Spectrum ports of Paperboy 2 and Teentle, Meentle, Needle, Tootles, and the Sega Genesis versions of the Terminator and Super Smash TV. In 1991, Perry shipped off to the US to start work at Virgin Games, which had been recently purchased by Viacom, and steady yourselves for this one, Blockbuster Video. Yes, there was a time when Blockbuster had the kind of money to drop on purchasing a whole other company, something they could have done in 2000 when they were offered the chance to buy Netflix for a cool 50 mil.
Netflix never fully recovered after that deal fell through, but Blockbuster have gone from strength to strength in Bizarro World.
The first game Perry worked on for Virgin was, perhaps predictably, a licensed game. The license was McDonald's, a company with a large stable of lovable characters, all with soft edges and big smiles. No, he didn't, he wasn't there yet. This was before he ruined everything. With a wealth of options, ultimately they decided not to bother using any of these guys and instead made Global Gladiators starring Mick and Mac, who'd also appeared in Virgin Games' MC Kids, otherwise known as McDonaldland, which had been released for a number of systems earlier that same year. In Global Gladiators, Mick and Mac get sucked into a comic book that doesn't exist where they become heroes nobody's heard of before to save 4 generically themed worlds from pollution, which is a difficult task when one of the worlds is literally called Slime World and your character runs around with a super soaker that is also full of slime, so cleaning the place up a bit is probably going to take a while. Global Gladiators is a decent enough, if forgettable, game that eventually got ported to the Amiga, which is where I played it as a kid, and also to the Sega Master System and Game Gear ports, which are nearly identical to each other on account of the similar hardware. There are also several unfinished prototypes for a Super Nintendo version out in the wilds of the internet, as well as a couple for a Game Boy port, and, this was a surprise discovery I made while researching this episode, an NES version that was quite far along in development when it was cancelled alongside the Game Boy and SNES versions for what Wikipedia says were legal reasons and for undisclosed reasons, citing sources for neither.
I did try to research why these ports had been cancelled, but I hit a wall when I realised that I couldn't actually be bothered.
Global Gladiators is exactly what it sounds like. It is a middle-of-the-road licensed platformer where the license in question is gastrointestinal distress, but it's also the first place you'll see a lot of the hallmarks of a David Perry platformer. Slick animation, fluid movement, an exit that can only be unlocked by collecting things, and a hella rad soundtrack by Tommy Tallarico. In fact, much of the game engine and the toolset used for Global Gladiators went on to be used in Perry's next game, which was Coldspot, another licensed platformer, this time based on the dot from the 7-Up logo for some reason. It's perhaps not an obvious selection for a video game spin-off, but it is perhaps marginally less baffling than Snapperazzi, an Amiga game I had as a kid that put you in the role of an alien paparazzi photographer taking photos of alien girls in bikinis that was sponsored by British tabloid The Sun, a candy called Fizzy Chewits, and Domino's Pizza. Why?
It should stress David Perry had nothing to do with Snapperazzi, but there are as many as 7 people out in the world who did, and I sincerely hope that they carry a heavy ball of shame and regret in their heart.
Coldspot dropped for the Sega Genesis in 1993, just 4 months before Aladdin hit the console, and ports for other systems came the following year for the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy, the Master System, the Game Gear, the Amiga, and PC MS-DOS. Again, a lot of Dave Perry's platform game staples can be found here. In particular, the way Coldspot's speed increases is near identical to how Aladdin moves. The reason for that is that these two games actually use the same game engine. This is most noticeable in the PC and Amiga ports of Aladdin, which use a HUD layout not dissimilar from the one seen in Coldspot, though this HUD does make it a little harder to tell exactly how much health you have left. Oh, it's the sand dial, the little leg. I've literally, my whole life I've been looking at the genie's face, and he's reacting to okay, alright, well, I'm an idiot. This might feel like Perry's team cutting corners, but it makes sense. Development of these two games overlapped, and Aladdin had a severely reduced development cycle, so it makes sense to recycle parts for one in the other. If you've got the tools, why not keep using them? That is exactly what Perry would continue to do when he started work on his next game at Virgin, The Jungle Book. Only Perry's team never finished The Jungle Book. During development, he and most of the team he used at Virgin left the company to form Shiny Entertainment, leaving Eurocom to finish development duties on the game. And it shows. The Jungle Book doesn't quite reach the highs of Aladdin, nor does it feel as consistent with the movie it's based on, but it was developed using the same tools that Perry's team had used. Tools that Shiny would continue to use on their very first post-Virgin project. That's a horrible turn of phrase, I'm sorry. Anyway, the next game was Earthworm Jim, a superb platform game featuring a character created by Doug TenNapel, seen here believing that gay marriage should be illegal. That is true, that's a thing he has said publicly. He's also said a number of transphobic statements. He's basically a terrible human being who, unfortunately, also happens to have created one of the most memorable video game characters of the 90s, so shit. This is arguably Perry's peak, and it all starts to go a bit downhill from here, eventually leading into this, which, yeah. But the superb Earthworm Jim and its slightly less enjoyable, but by no means less desirable sequel were juggernauts of the 90s platform game era. These were games that other platform games wanted to be like. Slick, cool, confident, distinct, often funny, and frequently doing the unexpected.
Earthworm Jim seems to use more or less the same game engine as Perry's pre-Shiny platform games, or at least a pretty reasonable recreation, but there is one tool that is used across all of Perry's platform games.
Tomb, or the Ultimate Map Editor, is a pretty simple to use tool that allows you to make and edit, maps for video games. According to the only lists I can find, one on the Tomb website and the other on SegaRetro.org, the tool was used for about a dozen or so games, with the majority of those being Virgin titles with David Perry's involvement. Perry himself would likely have first come across the tool while working on the Terminator for the Sega Genesis, though it was also put to use on a couple of other Virgin games that Perry didn't work on, including MC Kids, the other licensed McDonald's game I mentioned that came out for the NES a few months before Global Gladiators hit store shelves. Though Perry left Virgin to form Shiny, his influence is still felt in games like The Jungle Book, which, as I mentioned, he worked on for a bit before pinching most of the team to form Shiny, and The Lion King, which used many of the same tools and featured a similar approach to its design as Aladdin, with the added bonus that this one actually got a Super Nintendo release. Huzzah! By 1995, the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn were out in the world, and the gaming landscape began to shift away from 2D platformers and towards 3D games. And though there'd be some exceptions, 2D platformers began to die out as developers focused instead on the massive leap forward in gameplay and visuals offered by the third dimension.
Marvelous, incredible.
But Perry's influence would be felt throughout the industry for a while yet, not just with games like Donkey Kong Country, but other games, including Nintendo's other mid-90s platform masterpiece, Yoshi's Island. Nintendo initially rejected Shigeru Miyamoto's pitch for Yoshi's Island because it looked too much like a traditional Mario game, and they wanted to chase the kind of visual oomph that Aladdin and their own Donkey Kong Country had brought to the table. Miyamoto-san rejected their rejection and doubled down on the simpler visuals, going so far as to dial things back to a childlike, hand-drawn style that actually was drawn by hand, scanned in, and then recreated in pixel art, which, of course, Nintendo approved. That's two Nintendo classics that would not exist, or at least wouldn't exist as we know them, were it not for the influence of David Perry and his ragtag team of coders, animators, artists, musicians, and at least one homophobe. Miyamoto-san wasn't kind about the competition though, even if the competition was being produced by Nintendo themselves. At the time, he is alleged to have said, "Donkey Kong Country proves that players will put up with mediocre gameplay as long as the art is good." Yikes. Every single David Perry platformer from the 90s is, to use the parlance of the youth, a bop. Am I using that right? Okay. His games are a delicate balancing act of design and aesthetic, and in the hands of lesser people, that's a balance that might not have worked. Case in point, when Earthworm Jim was given the HD treatment in 2010, it didn't feel right. The developers of this port fumbled a lot of the basic elements of the game, in particular the timing on the animations. Gone is the slick motion and comedic timing of the original, which is a pity. Even his average stuff, the stuff nobody remembers, is above average. His forgettable games are head and shoulders above most of the stuff that was coming out in this era, and not only did he show us just how enjoyable character-based platform games could be with a little imagination, he also showed us that licensed games don't always have to be terrible. That's an influence we're still feeling the effects of today, with games over the last decade like Batman Arkham Asylum from Rocksteady Studios, Telltale Games' Walking Dead series, and the PS4 exclusive Spider-Man by Insomniac Games. These are critically acclaimed, commercially successful games based on licenses that haven't always been given this level of care, love, and attention by other publishers or developers.
David Perry's last games before departing Shiny were Enter the Matrix and The Path of Neo, which is kind of a dour note to end this history lesson on, so instead I'm going to offer you some pleasing lies. He's the engineer behind the Dreamcast 2, a console deemed too awesome to be released. He invented the beignet, co-wrote the script for Star Trek Beyond, and through time travel shenanigans is actually your father, and he wants you to know how proud he is of you. Goodbye.
Thank you for watching this episode of PortsCenter. I've really missed making the show regular. I want to get back into doing it on a regular basis. With that in mind, the next episode here on FilmJoy of PortsCenter is going to be all about... Look forward to that. The next video I do for FilmJoy actually won't be a PortsCenter episode, but then after that, obviously, there'll be some... You should be able to enjoy that in a few weeks. But don't forget to do the usual YouTube-y stuff like share, subscribe, write the name of this channel on the side of a rock and throw it at a goose. don't do that. Geese haven't done anything to justify that. But I will see you again with another video very, very soon.